Hello everyone and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today we are going to be talking about something a little different. We're going to be talking about Stranger Things, The First Shadow, and how that fits into the Stranger Things show. A lot of you might not know this about me. I am a pretty big Stranger Things fan. I've been watching the show ever since season 1 came out on Netflix. So it's been really special to sort of like grow up with the show. And I am very excited for the final season to come out whenever it does come out. It's filming right now. And recently, me and my boyfriend have been doing commentary tracks for the full 4 seasons of Stranger Things on his Patreon, which I will link down in the description below. But in my recent rewatch of the show, it's gotten me thinking a lot about the first Shadow play that they've been putting on over in London and what it is, how it connects with the show. So I figured we'd sort of talk about that today, sort of unpack what the play is, and kind of create a timeline of Stranger Things to see how it fits in. So first things first, what is The First Shadow? The First Shadow is a play set within the world of Stranger Things. It's written by Kate Fry, who is also a writer and co-executive producer of the show. The story of the show serves as a prequel to the events of Stranger Things, and according to Kate Fry and the Duffer Brothers, the events of the play are canon to the show. According to the First Shadow website, this is a synopsis of the play. Hawkins, 1959. A regular town with regular worries. Young Jim Hopper's car won't start. Bob Newby's sister won't take his radio show seriously. And Joyce Maldonado just wants to graduate and get the hell out of town. When new student Henry Creel arrives, his family finds that a fresh start isn't so easy, and the shadows of the past have a very long reach. Brought to life by a multi-award-winning creative team who take theatrical storytelling and stagecraft to a whole new dimension, this gripping new adventure will take you right back to the beginning of Stranger Things' story and may hold a key to the end. So basically this play mostly follows Henry Creel before we see him in Stranger Things season 4, but it also has a couple of characters that we know and love. It's got Joyce Byers, or known at the time, Joyce Maldonado. It's got Jim Hopper, Bob Newby, Dr. Brenner. Definitely a lot of familiar faces, mostly the parents of the kids in the show. We've got Patty Newby, which is a new character, Bob's sister, I think adoptive sister. I think Bob is adopted into the family, I think. The whole Creel family, Ted Wheeler, Karen Wheeler, before she becomes Karen Wheeler. All of the moms in the play have their maiden names, so like they have different last names technically, but I'm just gonna say the names that we know from the show to make it easier. Charles and Sue Sinclair, Claudia Henderson, Chief Hopper, which would be Jim Hopper's dad, so Hopper Sr., Principal Newby, which would be Bob and Patty's dad, Alan Munson, who would be Eddie Munson's dad, and then Walter Henderson, who is Dustin's father. And to give you a rough idea of the ages of these characters in this play, Joyce and Hopper and Bob are all seniors at Hawkins High, and Henry Creel is a freshman at Hawkins. Now, I just want to put this out there. I have not seen this play. Obviously, I do not live in London, nor have I ever been to London. So all of this information that I'm about to talk about is either second or third hand information that I've gotten from people that have seen the play. A lot of my information is also from Stranger Things Wiki. So you can take everything that I say about the play with like a slight grain of salt because I have not had a firsthand experience with the play. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna try and dissect it in like a timeline order, meaning that the play reveals some of this information that we're about to go over, not in chronological order. It like reveals this information through flashbacks after a bit of the play has like played out. But for the sake of this YouTube video, and for the sake of making this all make sense, we're gonna build a chronological timeline of the play and the TV show to help explain how this all ties together. So the play actually starts out in 1943, so that's where our timeline is going to start. It follows a U.S. Navy ship called the USS Eldridge that was involved in secret government experiments known as both Project Rainbow and the Philadelphia Experiment. The USS Eldridge carries a crew, and that crew includes Dr. Brenner's father, Papa Sr., if you will. In an attempt to use a force field to like turn the ship invisible, the ship is accidentally transported to a place called Dimension X, where the entire crew, except for Dr. Brenner's dad, dies, like almost immediately. They're all killed by what's called strange humanoid creatures, aka Demogorgons. When Brenner's dad makes it back from Dimension X, he returns really sick, and he's unable to accept any blood transfusions because Dimension X made his blood all freaky and wacky. And on his deathbed, he tells Martin Brenner about Dimension X, sparking Brenner's obsession with opening a gate and finding Dimension X himself. Now, before we get any further into the timeline, we have to talk about Dimension X and what it even is. Because when I first started reading up on the play, I thought that Dimension X was just like a fancy word for the Upside Down. It is not. It is a fully different thing. Dimension X is a mysterious alternate dimension existing in parallel with the human world. As of right now, Dimension X has a pretty unclear relationship to the Upside Down, which is something that I think season 5 is definitely going to talk about, or at least touch on a little bit. Dimension X is very orange, and it's seemingly full of like floating rocks, floating particles, tentacle vines, and demogorgons kind of like roaming freely. The Upside Down is a completely different looking dimension, where the Upside Down is more blue and darker, and it's seemingly a perfect physical copy of the human world. And as we all know, the Upside Down is just frozen on November 6th, 1983. The only kind of connection that these two dimensions have as of right now that we know is that the Upside Down is seemingly infected with Dimension X's spores and vines and demogorgons and all that stuff. We do not know how long Dimension X has existed before 1943, and seemingly the Upside Down was created on November 6th, the day that 11 touched a demogorgon in the void and opened a gate. Now that we all know what Dimension X is and the difference between Dimension X and the Upside Down, we can get back into our timeline. But I do have to give another warning about this next part of the timeline. It's very confusing. A lot of these dates that were given are super vague. We're not even given exact years for a couple of them. It's like a broad decade span of years. And no offense to the Duffer Brothers, but they are not the best when it comes to dates and characters' ages and paying attention to dates that they've created within their own fictional world. So a lot of these years are going to be rough estimates. We're also going to have moments in time where we have conflicting reports on certain dates. So we're going to do the best that we can. Remember, like I said, take everything with a grain of salt. This is all a rough outline. So next we're looking at the sort of early 1950s, where after the Philadelphia experiment, Dr. Brenner and his staff begin working on something called the Nevada experiment, which is an attempt to recreate what happened to the USS Eldridge in 1943. The government facility where they host all of these experiments is in Rachel, Nevada, which also happens to be where our Creel family is residing before their move to Hawkins. During these experiments, a staff member steals some essential equipment and runs away, hiding the equipment inside a nearby cave system. Around the same time, a young Henry Creel is exploring the Nevada caves while playing with his spyglass. And while exploring, Henry stumbles upon this stolen equipment. The equipment is activated, transporting Henry and the random staff member from the lab into Dimension X. The staff member is killed immediately, but Henry survives. In Dimension X, Henry sees glimpses of demogorgons and he is exposed to the Mind Flayer. Henry's missing for about 12 hours in Dimension X before he returns back to his world with completely different blood and a very altered personality. Then, after an unknown amount of time, it could be the same day, it could be weeks later, I'm not sure, Brenner recovers the stolen equipment in these caves, and he also finds Henry's spyglass, which is what allows him to track Henry down, essentially following him to Hawkins, I would assume. Now, this next date is information that we actually get from our show, but I'm including it in the timeline because we're trying to figure out how this play fits into the narrative of the show that we already know. In 1953, Dr. Brenner is involved in Project MKUltra. Project MKUltra is a CIA-sanctioned research program that goes on from 1953 to 1973. And this project essentially has the goal of developing mind control techniques that could be used against their enemies during the Cold War. And one of the test subjects in the experiments includes Terry Ives, which, as we all know, is Eleven's mom. And apparently, according to my research, the experiments for Project MKUltra start in Hawkins. So whether that means that Brenner is in Hawkins by 1953, or maybe he's just traveling back and forth from Hawkins to Nevada, I'm not sure. They don't touch on Project MKUltra in the play to my knowledge. So it's hard to say. I don't really think that that's something that matters, nor do I think the Duffers will ever go into the exact timeline. Now, moving into 1959, this is where most of our play actually takes place. Like I said, we get little flashbacks to like 1943, and we get flashbacks to Henry in the cave system and all that stuff, but like the crux of the play takes place in 1959. But before we get into all that, we have to sort of talk about the various reports that we have of when the Creel family actually moved to Hawkins, because depending on what you look at, there's lots of different answers. So basically, there's two newspapers in the show that you can read that recount the Creel murders. There's the Indianapolis Gazette and the Weekly Watcher. So before I even get into 1959, Hawkins and the Creels moving to Hawkins and all that stuff, I want to point out the differences in these newspapers. So in the Indianapolis Gazette, if you read it, it says that Victor Creel is 35 in 1959. It says that the murders occur on Saturday, March 21st, 1959. It says that the Creel family has lived in Hawkins for 2 years by the time the murders occur, which would mean they moved to Hawkins in 1957. There's no Henry Creel in this article. There is only an Edward Creel listed as Victor's son, but Henry Creel is not mentioned in this article. His name is just a completely different name. Alice is also listed as Victor's wife, and Virginia is listed as the daughter. It says that Victor did 2 tours in the war, and the newspaper is listed as being published on Thursday, March 26th, 1959. The other newspaper that we have is the Weekly Watcher. This one says that Victor Creel is 40 in 1959. There's no clear dates in this article as to when the murders happened, and there's no clear date as to how long the Creels have been living in Hawkins before the murders. But there's details such as like the groundsperson and the gardener working at the Creel house that seem to indicate that they've been living there for a while. Henry is mentioned in this article. There's no Edward Creel, so they get Henry's name correct in this article. And according to the Weekly Watcher, as of 1959, Virginia is 36, Alice is 15, and Henry Creel is 12. That's important. Virginia is correctly listed as Victor's wife, and Alice is correctly listed as the daughter. There's no mention of how long Victor was at war, and the newspaper is also listed as being published on March 26, 1959. Then you do have to take into account what Victor says in the show during Dear Billy when Nancy and Robin are visiting him. This is both information like from the show when Victor is speaking and also from the script. Victor is listed as being 40 in 1959 and 67 in 1986. The murders occurred on March 25th, 1959. The Creel family had lived in the house for a little over a month before the killing started. So there is an exact date for the murders, but there's no exact date for when the Creels moved in. As of 1959, Virginia is 36, Alice is 15, and Henry is 12. Victor was in France in 1944, but he had been back from the war 14 years as of 1959, which he says. So this would have him returning from the war in 1945. So I know I just threw a lot of information at you. Let's narrow it down. We've got 2 newspapers. We've got Victor Creel's recounting of the story. We've got Henry's own retelling of the story later on in some episodes. And we have the play's retelling of the story. That's one big, very confusing, very conflicting timeline. I can't tell you which one to believe, especially because it's very possible that the newspapers are so incredibly unreliable. Like, I don't think the Duffers care that much about details. Sorry, I hate to say it, but I don't think they do. It's very possible that, like, ChatGPT was used to just make these articles so that they could have something on the screen, probably not thinking that anybody was going to screenshot and zoom in and actually read these newspaper articles. Not to mention there's other moments in the show, specifically in season 4, that just aren't really trustworthy. We know that the Duffers forgot about Will Byers' birthday, and also on Eddie's missing poster that Wayne puts up at the end of the show, it says that Eddie is 17. And that's just not correct because Eddie is a 3-year senior, so that would put him closer to 21. So our timeline from here on out, like I have been saying, is going to be rough estimates of years. But stick with me, I think the timeline will make sense as we finish it out. So any time between 1957 and 1959, the Creel family moves to Hawkins. Now, it's very confusing, and I think this is the part that is the most confusing because it's the most important in a way. If you look at it one way, the show has Henry Creel at age 12 in 1959 when the murders happen. However, in the first shadow, they explicitly state that Henry is a freshman in high school, which would make him 14 years old. So to me, what would make the most sense in my head is that the Creels moved to Hawkins in 1957. And we can maybe assume that this is when Henry was 12, because then that would allow Henry to be 14 in 1959. The only thing that this kind of contradicts is Victor's retelling of the story to Nancy and Robin, but only kind of, because he just says that they only had 1 month of peace in the house before the killing of animals started. That doesn't necessarily mean that they moved in a month before Henry decided to start killing animals. Plus, we know Victor Creel's not really in the best mental state possibly, so it's possible he misremembers how long they were in the house for. There's so many varying factors to try to figure out this timeline and to try to figure out when the Creels moved to Hawkins. You kind of just have to pick whatever storyline works best in your head and follow that. In the play, to my knowledge, they have the Creels moving to Hawkins in 1959, or at least they show them fully living in Hawkins in 1959. So long story short, the most important thing here is that by 1959, the Creels were fully living in Hawkins, Indiana, and we are supposed to believe that Henry Creel is 14. And like I said, 1959 is where the crux of the show takes place, so we're going to have a couple of things happening in 1959. So in the play, Henry Creel joins Hawkins High School, and this is where he meets Patty Newby. Patty Newby is his love interest in the play. Patty Newby, like I said, is the sister of Bob Newby and the daughter of the principal of Hawkins High. Henry and Patty form a really close bond, and Henry ends up revealing his powers to Patty. Patty encourages Henry that he can use his powers for good and all this stuff. I think we see Henry use his powers for good once, and that's when he like creates a vision for Patty, and then I guess Patty like sings a song in the vision. I don't know. That sounds like play stuff. You know what I mean? You got to be there to see it. But essentially the point is they form a sort of romantic bond, and they meet every day after school, and they even kiss once, I think. Very freshman in high school romance, if you will. It is very weird to think about Henry having any sort of romantic relationship with anybody though. Like that just doesn't seem like a character trait for him, but I'm sure it works in the play like when you're watching it. At this time, Henry is overcome by the influence of a shadowy presence, which is the Mind Flayer. His mind enters what he likes to call the battlefield, which is essentially the void. And this is where he proceeds to start killing lots of animals. He even kills Claudia's cat. So Dustin's mom just, I guess, has a history of her cats dying, which is really sad. In the first shadow, there's a moment where Henry almost accidentally kills Principal Newby, and he leaves him seriously injured and blinded. Upon hearing this news, Virginia decides to send Henry to Dr. Brenner. So also by 1959, Brenner is fully in Hawkins. I guess it doesn't quite matter how he got there, but all that matters is he's there. I think Brenner even drugs Virginia Creel to like get information out of her about Henry. But so after Virginia hears about Henry almost killing Principal Newby, she sends him to Dr. Brenner. Brenner takes Henry to Hawkins National Lab and starts doing some tests on him. In the play, this is where it's revealed that Dr. Brenner's dad survived Dimension X and that Henry went to Dimension X himself. Henry goes into a sensory deprivation chamber and shows Dr. Brenner a Demogorgon like through one of the screens in the lab. So then apparently Brenner tries to force Henry to kill a prisoner, and Henry refuses, and he sort of like has a big freak out panic attack moment, I guess, and he injures 2 of the guards, and he demands like to be let go. Like, I don't want to be in this lab anymore. I want to go home. Brenner lets him go home, but Brenner also realizes that the reason Henry is not willing to kill human beings is because he has love in his life, and he finds out that that love is Patty Newby. So then Brenner vows to find her and kill her. So then Henry returns home, and he can tell that his family is not happy about him being there. Henry uses his powers to read his mom's mind and can see that she doesn't want him there and she wants to send him back to Dr. Brenner. This checks out. This is something that Henry actually tells us in the show. And then the way that this next part is worded, I think is super interesting and I think is very important, and we will talk about this like overall at the end of this video. But apparently Henry then allows the Mind Flayer to kill his sister and mother with Henry's powers. He attempts to kill his father, fails, and then runs to the school where Patty is starring in Joyce's play. I think Joyce's play is like a whole subplot of the first shadow. Henry and Brenner run in at the same time, and Brenner is like, she's your weakness, Henry, and Patty's like, don't listen to him, Henry, and this very much overwhelms young Henry Creel, and the Mind Flayer takes over, and he accidentally like shoves Patty off the stage thinking he killed her. Brenner then takes Henry to Hawkins National Lab and basically keeps him there. This contradicts with Victor's retelling of the story, where he wakes up out of his trance and he sees Alice dead on the floor and Henry like passed out on the floor, and we see him sort of like scoop Henry up and cradle him and whatnot. Victor tells us that Henry was in a coma for about a week, and then Victor was told that Henry died. Obviously we know that that's not true, and that's a lie from the lab to cover up Henry's death. But the point still stands that in Victor's memory of the story, Henry was there when he came out of his trance. So that's a really contradicting moment of the story for the play versus the show. I think, you know, you could probably try and make it make sense, like, oh, while Victor was in his trance, Henry went to the school, and then Henry came back and then passed out, and then Brenner took him to the lab. Or Henry wasn't there and Victor Creel just remembers it that way because maybe the lab was able to do something to Victor to make him remember it a certain way. I try not to think about it too much. I think that's something that the Duffers and Kate Fry just didn't really think about or really care about when it came to writing the play. Long story short, it's important to note that Victor and Henry Creel are both not reliable narrators. And I think their intention with the first shadow is that it's an objective third party telling of the story. So that is a reliable narration of what happened. When we look at what Victor says and when we look at what Henry says, we can't necessarily take their telling of the story at 100% truth because they're unreliable narrators. And we'll get into that more later on. So then the rest of the play, I think, kind of checks out with the show. Brenner takes Henry to the lab. He tattoos a 1 on him. And for an unknown amount of time, he conducts experiments on Henry. And then he inserts Sotera into Henry's neck, which we see in the show. Something that's important to note is that the play reveals that Brenner was using Henry's blood and infusing it into the pregnant woman of MK Ultra. And that's how all of the subjects that we see in season 4 at Hawkins National Lab have all their special telekinetic powers. It's because Brenner took Henry's blood and infused it into the mother's. So Henry's not the biological father of any of these kids. He just gave blood, not necessarily willingly, but he gave blood like to the mothers, and that's what caused all of their kids to have these powers. Now, this part of the timeline is from the TV show, but we're still going to be filling in this timeline with TV show moments. In 1971, Terry Ives gives birth to 11. 11 is then taken by Brenner, and her birth is recorded as a miscarriage. This is seemingly when the first shadow play ends, because it ends with a time jump, and it has older Henry being introduced to a small child where he says, "I have plans for you and me, 11." So seemingly the play probably ends around 1971. Now, I do have a breakdown of like the rest of the timeline of Stranger Things, including the play. I'm not going to get into that for this video because that would make this video a really, really long one, but I can make a separate video breaking down the entire timeline all the way up to the end of season 4 if that interests anybody. So if that's something you want to see me do, let me know. It is a really interesting timeline and I did have a lot of fun making it, but we're going to stop our timeline in 1971 where seemingly the play also ends. So that's sort of the timeline that we're working with for the play, and that's a sort of rough synopsis of what happens in the play. Obviously, I think there's a couple of other subplots that happen because Joyce and Hopper have a whole thing, and Joyce has her play, and then Hopper goes off to the war. It's a whole thing. So obviously stuff happens in the play that I didn't talk about. I mainly kept my focus just on Henry Creel and Dr. Brenner. Now I want to talk about what I think Stranger Things 5 is going to take from the play, because I don't necessarily think they're going to take everything or talk about everything. I do think that Henry's blood being transfused into the pregnant women is definitely going to be mentioned, because I think one of the questions that season 5 has to answer is the relationship between Henry Creel and 11 and like why 11 is so special to him. I also think that they're somehow going to talk about Brenner's obsession with Dimension X and the Upside Down, even though Dr. Brenner's dead. But I think they'll talk about that because I also think that Henry being exposed to Dimension X at a young age is something that's important. That's what gives him his powers, and that's what exposes him to the Mind Flare and starts this whole thing. So I think that that's definitely something that they're going to have to mention in some way, shape, or form. But also it's very possible that they're not going to feel like they have a lot of time to go into Henry's backstory in season 5, because season 5 is going to have to be like this. It's the last season. It really has to get stuff done. It has to come to a conclusion. So they might not feel like they have time to sort of lollygag and talk about Henry's past, and maybe that's what the play is for, to talk about Henry Creel's past. But most importantly, I think that the fact that the play clearly states that the Mind Flare is doing the killing through Henry will be brought up. And on that topic, I want to talk about who is in charge. Like, who is the big bad of the show? In the show, when Henry recounts what happens to him in Dimension X after 11 sends him there in 1979, he has his whole, monologue speech. He saw a means to transcend his human form to become the predator he was always born to be. And then we see Henry sort of like shape the Mind Flare into a spider-like shape because Henry is obsessed with spiders. When Vecna has 11 in episode 9 of the show, He explains to her that it was him the whole time, and all he needed was for someone to open the door for him, which is what he claims Eleven did back in 1983 when she opened a gate to the Upside Down. And then when Eleven kept trying to close these gates, Henry claims that he sought out her powers, her ability to open gates, which is what happens in season 3 when the Mind Flayer gets into Eleven's leg and sort of steals her powers. According to Henry, he's the one that's in control, and he's the one in charge of everything in the Upside Down, and it's been him this whole time. However, if you look at the play, it seems like they're going with the narrative that the Mind Flayer actually controls Henry and uses Henry as a vessel for killing. Like, for example, from everything I've read, it's described as Henry allowing the Mind Flayer to use his powers to kill his family. Similarly, back when season 3 came out, when Billy is possessed, we were under the impression that he was possessed by the Mind Flayer. But now, if you rewatch season 3 with the context of season 4, you watch the scene where Billy is having his whole monologue to Eleven when they're technically in the void. You wonder if that's actually Vecna speaking through Billy. But now, with the knowledge of the play, you have to wonder, is it actually Vecna, or was it just the Mind Flayer, or was it both? Is there a separation of Vecna and the Mind Flayer at this point, or has the Mind Flayer taken over Vecna so much that Vecna is just the human version of the Mind Flayer? Lots of questions. But also, in season 4, Dustin and Lucas are having a conversation. I think it's during Massacre at Hawkins' Lab, I want to say. They talk about how the Mind Flayer wants to take over the world. And Dustin says that if the Demogorgon was just the Mind Flayer's foot soldier, then Vecna is his 5-star general, which I think is interesting. That kind of makes it seem like the Mind Flayer is the one that's in control. But then again, that conversation happens before Henry Creel reveals to Eleven in episode 9 that it's been him the whole time. Like I've mentioned, Katra Fry has said that Henry Creel is not a reliable narrator, and I can't decide if I like that or not. In a lot of ways, it seems like really lazy writing to be like, oh yeah, well, the show isn't 100% accurate because Henry isn't reliable, so now we can go back and we can change X, Y, and Z to make it fit whatever we want to write for season 5. That just feels a little lazy to me. I wish that they either thought it all the way out and didn't have to go back and sort of retcon anything or change anything, instead of just being like, oh yeah, well, that big reveal that happened in season 4, actually it's not true because Henry's not reliable, so it's actually this. Surprise! However, I do think it makes sense to have the Mind Flayer be the final boss of the show, because the Mind Flayer is an otherworldly creature, whereas Henry Creel was a normal human boy for many years of his life, and he was born in our dimension, and he was normal until he went to Dimension X and was exposed to the Mind Flayer. I think Henry's obvious disdain for the human race and the way that he views humans as so incompetent, and the way that he judges their way of life in the show actually makes a lot of sense if you look at it as the Mind Flayer speaking through Henry after witnessing humans through Henry's eyes for so long. It would make sense for a creature not of our dimension, not of the human race, to see the arbitrary way that we live. Henry talks about wake up, eat, go to work, reproduce, sleep, repeat, or whatever. And he has the whole monologue about days, weeks, months, that whole thing. How much he hates humans, I think makes a lot of sense if that's just the Mind Flayer speaking through Henry. Like I said, using Henry as a vessel. So, my final thoughts. Wrapping this up, I think the concept of them making the first shadow is super cool. It actually just won 2 awards at the Olivier Awards. I think I'm saying that correctly. It just won Best Entertainment and Best Set Design, which is really awesome, and I think those are pretty prestigious awards. I do think it's odd to claim that something is canon to a 4 going on 5 season show, but then limit who can see the production, because as of right now, the play is only on the West End, and they apparently don't have any plans to move the show out of London. I do know that they've said that you don't need to see the play to understand anything that's going to happen in season 5, and I fully believe that. But regardless, I still find it a little bit weird to do such a deep dive into the background of multiple characters in your franchise and not make it available to the very wide public of your very popular show. I do think that this story could have been super cool as a miniseries, like maybe 4, possibly 6 episodes, using the cast who played the Creel family when we see them in the 50s, and then just cast somebody to play a young Hopper, a young Joyce, a young Dr. Brenner, etc., etc. On one side of things, I do think making it a stage play gives them a loophole to change their canon if they see fit. Like, if something in the play disagrees with what they do in season 5, they can just be like, oh, well, the play is only partially canon, or, oh, yeah, the play actually isn't canon. Surprise! I do think that making it a stage play instead of making it like an actual miniseries makes it a little easier to bend the canon to their will. But on the other side of things, I think that making it a stage play gave them a really fun and unique opportunity to do storytelling in the Stranger Things universe in a different medium, because we know that the Duffer Brothers and their company can make a TV show. We've seen them do it for multiple seasons now, but it becomes a whole other challenge to add on to a story in a medium where you can't use CGI, there's no post-production, everything is live and changing and happening right in front of the audience's eyes, which I think is what theater is all about. I am a big musical theater fan, so I definitely understand the magic of the theater, if you will, and making a stage play. And I know how special it is to be in the audience and witness a play. Like, it's such a different medium from a TV show, and if that's something that they wanted to conquer, something they wanted to explore, I definitely think that this story was the best way for them to do that. Long story short, I think it'll be very interesting to see how much of this play affects season 5 of Stranger Things. I'm very excited to learn who the final boss is of the show. Is it Vecna? Is it the Mind Flayer? Is it a creature we haven't even met yet? I have no idea, and I think that that's going to be super interesting to learn and find out. The only thing I desperately want is for somebody to find the Duffer Brothers, sit them down, and just straight up ask them how old Henry is supposed to be in the show in 1959 when he commits the murders. Because really the only messy part of this timeline is how old Henry is. I would just love to have the Duffer Brothers sit down and clarify every error that is in their TV show. Then it'd be perfect. I had a lot of fun making this video. A lot of research went into it, and that was actually really fun for me to do. So let me know if you guys enjoyed it. I love talking about Stranger Things. I don't really do it all that much on my channel, but I love to do it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please let me know and I will talk about it even more. Like I said, I could do a video where I basically make a timeline of the entire Stranger Things show leading up to the very end of season 4. I also have plans to maybe do a video at some point where I basically break down every single thing we know about Stranger Things season 5 so far, which is actually a lot of stuff, believe it or not. So let me know if either of those videos interest you. I definitely would love to make them. Let me know if you've seen The First Shadow in the comments. I think I've only met like one person who has seen it, and I met them at a convention. But I would love to know if any of you have seen it, and if you have, what are your thoughts? Make sure you follow me on all my other social medias. I also have a podcast with my boyfriend that you can go and check out. And I also have a Patreon where I post reaction videos and commentary tracks every week. Make sure you go and check that out. If you really love Stranger Things, my boyfriend has a YouTube channel and he makes a whole lot of Stranger Things videos, so you can go and watch those. His YouTube is Filmstocked, and I will link it in the description below. But that does it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.